morning to all of my students. We are to discuss today globalization and liberalization in developing countries. Now, this is a topic which has been a buzzword nowadays in connection with discussion of public administration and politics. Globalization is in fact is not very new because from very many times earlier there is interactions between different nations. But what has made globalization and liberalization a completely new to this generation in the 1960s with the innovation of computer and with the innovation of technology and technological advancement which brought closer distance to all parts of the world. In fact, today this technology has made it possible for, I give you one example, to stock exchanges in New York, London or Bombay or Tokyo, they to respond immediately to any change in share market. So in this context, there has been some rethinking in the system of governance and administration in developing countries. In the earlier days, I mean in the 50s and middle of the 1960s, it was the general practice in the third world countries in Latin America, Africa and Asia that they are the newly independent states aspiring for development. And they were, in those days, were experimenting with the commandeering planning, particularly state control, public sector dependent or public sector led, one should say, and bureaucracy. But now, in the change context, since the 1970s, there has been a complete change. But this change has come a bit slowly, first in the late 1970s, then in the 1980s, and formally and in a big force in the 1990s. To be more specific, it was in the late 1980s, 1989, 1990, 1991, when there were certain changes, not only in the realm of technology, but also in the realm of politics, international relations, overall the globe. And this has made the globalization an inevitable process. So there are some plus points and some minus points of globalization which we can point out in our debate. But one point is very clear, that globalization is irreversible. This is a process which has been interpreted and seen by different countries in different ways, but I think the best definition of globalization has been offered in a document of the United Nations in 2001, that globalization means the internationalization of relations among nations between different regions and the process of intercommunication and international cooperation of goods, services, technology, ideas and the finished products. So now everybody is bound to accept, by sheer development of communication technology and by sheer compulsion of political changes, to accept globalization. One major change was definitely the downfall of the USSR and the communist East European countries. Since then, really there has been a change throughout the globe, that ideas, people, technology and administration to that extent has been influencing one another. So far as Indian context is concerned, we find globalization started, to be more specific, in 1991, when the then government of India was forced to adopt a new model of economic development. That is, for the first time, Indian government leaders and the political leaders, they understood very much that the previous model, what is popularly known as Nehruvian model of development, which was largely based on the Soviet model of planning, is not practicable to follow. Because of that, and this feeling, I think, was developed by a particular economic situation in 1991 in India, when it was found that balance of payment crisis has come to a critical position. So much so that India's balance of payments, India's reserves could last for a week or so. So it was a panic-stricken government of India which had to accept the model of globalization for development of the country. So this is what I say the background of globalization and liberalization, and in that context we have to define globalization as an international cooperation and international compulsion at the same time. Because if in a developing country, that is newly independent third world countries, want to do business for changing their economic level, for promoting their standard of living, then they will have to cooperate with the raising forces of global economic and technology. So once this feeling was felt deeply in developing countries, and for our own country India, there was no other way but to follow the model of globalization development. And in this model, the international financial institutions, especially the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, played a key role. It is a fact that we are, since 1990s, or to be more specific, since the middle of the 1990s, we are living in a world of politics and administration which has been described by some experts as borderless world. There are nations, but there are other international institutions which has made it practically obligatory for the nations to make international cooperation compulsory. For example, United Nations as such is there since the end of the Second World War, but in the 1980s it was found, and since then it was found that other UN organizations like World Health Organization, then the WTO, that is World Trade Organization, then the Intergovernmental Climatic Change, then Framework Convention for Climatic Change. So these are some of the specific, what I just given some examples, these are some of the specific international organization and institution which has made it practically obligatory for all the developing nations and the developed nations to enter into a process of mutual cooperation and mutual influence. And this very process, which has been termed globalization, has its accompanying process of liberalization. That is, the old structure of administration had to be liberalized, rules and regulations had to be revised, and new institutions had to be generated so that there can be a smooth functioning of global influences having impact on administration and decision making. If we look at the socio-economic context of this, we find that across the world, especially across the third world, that is the countries of Asia, particularly South Asia and Southeast Asia, and the countries of Africa, and to some extent the Latin American countries, they are all involved in a common struggle, common endeavor, a common so-called revolution of development. That is, main worry is how to develop the country, and this development of the country more specifically means upgrading the standard of living of the masses. And for achieving this, the previous colonized world, that is what we call now the third world countries, they had to accept some of the conditions and technically called the conditionalities of International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And this is what is very popularly is known as impact of globalization and liberalization. A very institutional change which has come in this, that we have nation states, no doubt, and there is the international constitutional system in the United Nations, that practically 189 or 191 countries are members of the United Nations, big or small, developed and developing, and they have got technically all countries have only one vote in the General Assembly. But this is technical thing. In reality, there is the divide, and the divide is basically nowadays digital, in the sense that the countries which are more advanced technologically and industrially, they are in a better position to, I should say, quote and unquote, dictate conditionalities to the development seeking third world countries. The best example of it, that countries like India had to accept the conditionalities of International Monetary Fund in respect of monetary management, management of banking system, management of decision making in public administration, reinventing some of the processes of administration, reorganizing some of the organizational processes, so that there is a liberal atmosphere of giving and taking, and this process can be described as the scope of Western developed industrially advanced countries to have an easy entry to the economy, and through that ultimately the politics and administration of the developing countries. So this is the challenge and also an opportunity which is brought by globalization and liberalization. But I have pointed out earlier that this is a situation from which there is no escape. The process is practically irreversible. So the countries, all developing countries, they are trying to have some sort of an experiment of their own, that how to manage, quote and unquote, I use this fashionable word, that how to manage this process of globalization, liberalization, competitiveness and privatization. Due to these conditionalities of the international monetary institutions and financial aid-giving financial institutions, where there has been a change, a very important change, that apart from the national government, now there are two other major partners or stakeholders which are found to have impact on the development of these development seeking countries. First one is the international corporate sector, that is multinational corporations. They are having a free entry and they are imposing their own conditionalities of how to have their investment here and how to allow the economic cooperation between the advanced countries and the development seeking underdeveloped countries. Thirdly, it is because of this process that a third stakeholder has also arrived on the scene, that is the international and national NGOs, which we generally call the civil society agencies. So to repeat, this, the traditional state system, national state system is there. Then there is the international aid givers with their power of dictating terms and conditionalities. Third is the international multinational corporations and the international civil society organizations. So in this situation, the globalization basically now means a process accompanied by liberalization, privatization, and competitiveness. The first major change that it has brought in the life of the developing countries is that all the system of or decision making in the private sector has to be coordinated through a new term which is gaining more and more importance in this decision making, that is market. That is, the development processes nowadays is often described as market driven development process. That is to say, the decision making of investment, decision making of distribution of wealth, decision making of investment in production and distribution, everything is guided by the decision in the market. Now this is the said liberalization, that is from firm political commitment like the earlier, the erstwhile communist system. Now there is freedom, freedom of the market, freedom of the investors, freedom of the individual, what to choose, what to consume, etc. So this is generally a process in which every state system is now involved. Now this is facing this context, facing these situations, some economic experts from advanced countries in the third world like India, they have argued for a humanizing phase of globalization. They have argued that there could be a modification of the process of aid giving and decision making. The free direct investment is okay, but let it obey some of the basic national interest of the aid receiving countries. And what is more important is that the populous underdeveloped countries, they cannot ignore the interest of the common masses. They cannot ignore, by sheer political reasons, the needs and aspirations of the millions of the working class people and the very poor, marginalized, deprived sections of the society. Therefore, there is constant bargaining in this globalization, liberalization, competitiveness and privatization process. Sometimes from some quarters, there has been a claim that if decision making is handed over to the private sector more efficient on grounds of more efficiency, the problem ultimately comes, what about public accountability? So there has to be a compromise, there has to be a firm understanding between the aid giver globalized world and the aid receiving living in the globalized world. So in this sense, there has been an impact, I should say, on globalization on the administration or administrative system, or what the very fashionable now, the management system of public affairs. And this has changed the very system of public administration in developing countries. Those countries like the Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries and African countries particularly, they are facing this challenge and they are having their own answers to this. This is that there will be a change in the very system of management of the decision making in the country. That is to say, there will be public administration, there will be decision makers in the public bureaucracy, but they have to accept the rules of the game, that is, on grounds of increasing efficiency, a new system of performance management, a new system of auditing, a new system of transparency. These are all to be accepted. And in fact, one by one, administrative and political reforms are coming in the name of advancement in the globalized world. So if we are to accept or derive the most benefits from the process of globalization, liberalization, competitiveness and privatization, then I think the best bargain would be to introduce the efficiency of the private sector into the system of management in public sector. The bureaucracy as an institution or the bureaucrat or administrator in the system has undergone a solid change already in many of the countries like India, Bangladesh or some of the African countries and Southeast Asian countries, but Malaysia, Indonesia and other countries, that it is expected that public administrators or the bureaucrat has to play a change role, no longer the role of a controller, but the role of a facilitator, the role of a coordinator, the role of what we call a entrepreneurial manager in the public administration. That is to say, I find theoretically this movement and these changes has a close relations with the new theoretical advancement that has been there in public administration, that is New Public Management Movement, NPM. That is, the government will be entrepreneurial, that is to say, every time there is any change, the change must be transparent, the change must be reasonable, and the change must be based on a commitment on the part of the government to promote public good, taking the full advantage of international cooperation which goes by the name of globalization. In this change context, the bureaucrat has to be there in their role of administering the country, but the bureaucracy as a system must be responsible, always responsible and responsive to the needs of the populace. Otherwise, in course of time, we will find there may be confrontation between the aid givers and the aid receivers. Some of the experiences that we have already noticed, suppose in Hungary or in Greece or in Italy or in Spain, there can be confrontation because the conditionalities somehow or other has to be accepted, but at the same time the needs of the governed cannot be forgotten. After all, public administration has to be there, but certainly the old Weberian model of public administration has to yield to the pressures of globalization, and that will be good for the countries, good for the people, provided the final goal is never lost sight of. The final goal is equity and social justice. Now, who will determine what is social justice? Now, there is the crux of the impact of globalization and liberalization in developing countries. This is an ongoing struggle which is going on, and some of the really modernizing and enterprising countries, in which I would like to include modern India, they are very systematically trying to respond to the pressures so that we can, as a nation, have maximum benefits out of globalization. It is a basic point of any political system that, and in its wake, globalization and privatization have brought a new concept called good governance, capital G, good capital G governance. This is what is called an ideology of administration, and this was invented first in the Western countries, and then it was given as a model to the developing countries. And this good governance, again there is some differences between various definitions, but the common features are that first of all, any democratic country must have a solid democratic basis. That is, government must be based on free elections. Secondly, the government, the legally elected government must be fully accountable to the norms and the constitutions and the rules of the country, and through that to the people ultimately. And the process of governance must be transparent. And that is why we say most of the developing third world countries are going for a new kind of legislations, right to information. That is, every details of decision making in the management process, in the bureaucracy, in the administration, must be open to the people. And therefore, the basic point, after all, nothing of this could be achieved without the fundamental point that there must be rule of law. In this, some of the developing countries is miserably failing. They must be careful in future that unless rule of law, capital R and capital L, the rule of law must be maintained, otherwise there will be nothing that we can gain from so-called accountability, transparency, social justice, whatever we can call it.